Hello and welcome back to Ask a Creationist. I'm Todd Wood. I'm a young age creationist and I'm president of Core Academy of Science. I'm here to answer your questions about science, creation, evolution, Genesis, the Bible, theology, religion, science, whatever you got. We're interested in hearing from you. Connect with us on social media, Core Academy of Science, and you can ask your question there. And maybe we'll feature your question on a future episode. Today's question is, can we trust the Genesis genealogies? Okay, that's an interesting idea. So what we're talking about there, of course, is those genealogies that have all those begets and those ages, and you add them up and you get, the date that Adam and Eve were created. So can we trust these things? The long-winded version of the question, or the actually elaborated question, some scholars think the genealogies of Genesis 5 and 11 are unreliable for dating, because genealogies have a high chance of being incomplete. Hebrew words also do not require genealogies to follow exact father-son relationships. Wouldn't this mean that we can't really date the creation of Adam and Eve? All right, well, basically, as I said, this comes from this from Genesis 5 and 11. If you read through those chapters, I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but they basically follow this format. When father lived X years, he begat son, and father lived after he begat son Y years, and had other sons and daughters. And if you follow through the genealogy and add up the successive fathers' ages at which they begat their sons, then you should be able to come up with how many years it encompasses. And this has been done for literally millennia. And so maybe you have an older Bible, or maybe you've seen an older Bible from the 20th century, particularly the early 20th century. You will find these study Bibles where they have Genesis 1, BC 4004. And that is the date of creation that was sort of assigned essentially in the Age of Enlightenment, when the early modern period, when this sort of chronology work was very, very popular. And, there are other versions of this. There are other ways of adding it all up. There are some questions about, how do we anchor this to time that we know? Because the Bible sort of ends right after the birth and death of Jesus. And so, how do you fix that in with the time that we're experiencing now? Those sorts of questions. But so it's not always the same age, it's not always the same number of years, but it's usually on the order of thousands of years to get back to Adam and Eve. So essentially these go back to this article here by Professor William Henry Green, Primeval Chronology. This is published in 1890 in Bibliotheca Sacra, which is a biblical journal that continues to be published. Yeah. So here he is addressing these issues, and he's addressing these chronologies and saying, look, there are issues with the chronologies, some of which have been noted in the elaborated question here that I've addressed. You'll notice here he opens this article with an extended paragraph talking about the conflict of science and the Bible, right? So he's talking about the question of the possible reconciliation of the results of scientific inquiry, respecting the antiquity of man and the age of the world with scripture chronology has been long earnestly debated. And so scientists, deeming them irreconcilable, have been led to distrust the divine authority of scriptures. On the other hand, believers in the divine word have been led to look upon the investigation of science with an unfriendly eye, as though they were antagonistic to religious faith. So he's clearly motivated by the conflict that's been going on. And it isn't just a sort of banal kind of biblical question about a text and how it ought to be interpreted. This has some pretty important ramifications. He closes the paper basically after rehearsing all of his objections. And he says, on these various grounds, we conclude that the scriptures furnish no data for a chronological computation prior to the life of Abraham, and that the Mosaic records do not fix and were not intended to fix the precise date either of the flood or of the creation of the world. Ooh. Okay, well that's important, because if you're a young age creationist, you kind of want to know how old creation is. And if the Bible doesn't actually tell you how old creation is, that would seem to be a pretty big issue. So let's look at some of these objections. I didn't list them all because that would go on for hours, but here's some of the objections. So challenge number one. It's clear from the Bible itself that some of these genealogies have been abridged. They have been edited down for size. So, for example, here, Luke 3 rehearses the genealogy of Christ, goes over the generations around the flood, and has Arphaxad fathering Canaan, Arphaxad, the grandson of Noah, fathers Canaan, and Canaan fathers Selah. But if you go back to Genesis 11 and read the genealogy, you will see that Arphaxad directly fathers Selah. So Canaan got left out, or perhaps Canaan got inserted. It's not obvious which answer is correct, but yeah, one of those is correct. One of those genealogies has been modified. Challenge number 2, the Hebrew does allow ancestors to beget descendants. That is well within the reasonable use of the terms. So, for example, the Messiah is the son of David. Jesus is a son of David. The Pharisees would call themselves sons of Abraham. And so the idea of father-son, the idea of begetting or producing offspring, absolutely permitted ancestor-descendant without naming every person in between. So it is possible then, just because it says so-and-so begat so-and-so, that could entail many more generations than we actually see. We don't know. Challenge number 3. There are specific ambiguities, and these go on and 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 on. I think one of the easiest ones to illustrate here is the age of Abraham. So Genesis 11:26, we read that Abram's father Terah lived 75 years and begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Okay, great. A couple verses later, the days of Terah were 205 years, and he died in Haran, which is the city where he's living with Abram and Lot at the time. So Abram and Lot and Terah go to Haran to live, and there Terah dies at 205. So if Terah was 75 when he had Abram, and he lived to be 205, then that means Abram must be 130 when Terah dies, right? Well, just a couple of verses later, Genesis 12:4, Abram was 75 years old when he departed Haran. So that would mean he is either 75 or less when Terah died, which is quite different from just those few verses before. So there's a little puzzle here, and I think the answer is a little simple. Terah lived 75 years and begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran. That's when he became a father. But that doesn't necessarily mean he had all 3 of those boys in the same year, unless his wife had triplets or he had 3 wives. Now, I guess that's possible, but I think the more likely explanation, given the discrepancy that we come to when we do that math, is that that's when he first became a father, and that the listing of those 3 names there goes in order of importance. And Abram is the most important, so he gets listed first, not because he is the firstborn, and not because he was born when Terah was 75 years old. Okay, so yeah, when the scripture is pretty explicit here, Abram was 75 years old when he departed Haran, after the death of Terah. All right, and there are other examples of those. I'm not going to go into that. We could go on for hours. Challenge number 4, secular histories don't match. And we could talk about Egyptian chronology and so forth. That's very interesting, but to me, this is sort of the question at hand. If I can add up all these ages in the genealogies and they contradict what I see from secular learning, which one am I supposed to accept? And so the real question to me is, can I add up those chronologies from those ages? Can I make a chronology out of those ages? And I don't know that this question, this point here, really ought to carry a lot of weight in settling that question. Because if that question is settled as, yes, this definitely makes a chronology and it has from the beginning, then I think that has certain implications for the secular histories, namely that they're probably incorrect. So yeah, this is an interesting challenge, but I don't give it too much weight. Challenge number 5, the Sumerian king list. I think this is really interesting. This is super interesting. This is one of the copies of the Sumerian king list here. These are found in archaeological locations around the ancient Near East, and you will find these king lists where there's these really weird ages. So when we read through the genealogies of Genesis, you'll find patriarchs living for centuries, right? So before the flood, they all lived to be about 900 or something, 900 and some years old. After the flood, they're still living 400, 200 years old. It's wildly improbable based on modern human aging and senescence. And in the Sumerian king list, we have the same sort of thing. We have kings that live for millennia. The first set of kings that are listed in the Sumerian king list, I think they encompass about 250,000 years, which is fairly impressive. Now, one could look at this and say, aha, Here's an example where you have patriarchs from the ancient Near East that are given wildly improbable ages in order to signify some importance that we don't understand in our modern world. And so the genealogies of Genesis are not giving us chronological information. They're giving us some sort of information about how important these people are. And I suppose that could be. I suppose it could be that in certain cultural contexts, using a word that has a sort of a dictionary definition in one way or in one context takes on an entirely different meaning, right? So if I say something is cool, I do not mean that it is cold or that its temperature is lower than my body temperature. I mean that it is nice and fun and interesting. And so cool is just a slang, right? And so we know from context, when I use that word, you know how to interpret it. And so maybe that's what's going on here in Genesis. On the other hand, you could also interpret this as being in the Sumerian king list confirms that people used to live really long times. Maybe the ages aren't exactly correct in the Sumerian kings list. Maybe the Sumerian king list is the corrupted version of a historical memory that is recorded correctly for us in the book of Genesis. Challenge number 6, and this one I think is also really interesting. Different manuscripts have different ages. So here on the left, I'm showing you all the begetting ages for the first 10 or so generations in Genesis 5, and on the left is the Septuagint ages. This is an early Greek translation of the Old Testament. In the middle, we have the Masoretic Hebrew. This was the sort of the Pharisaic, rabbinical, official manuscript that's pretty well supported among the manuscripts at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then on the right is the Samaritan Pentateuch. We don't know a lot about this, but the basic idea is that this is the Pentateuch that was preserved by the northern tribes after they split. And so this version of the Pentateuch has been deliberately edited in places to make it less suitable for Jerusalem and Judah, which makes sense. So when you look at these 3 columns, you can see that one on the left has a lot more 100 and 100 plus ages than the one in the middle or the one on the right. The one on the right has the least number of 100 plus ages at begetting. So when you add up those ages, the Septuagint, you get more than 2,000 years from creation to the flood. The Masoretic gives you 1656 between creation and the flood. Samaritan Pentateuch around 1,300 years. And you might wonder, well, then which one is right? And that's an interesting question. But I think the more interesting question is who decided that it was okay to monkey around with these ages? And why did they do it? And it's not obvious to me why any of these people would want to do this, unless the ages meant something that I don't quite understand. Or there might be some other ulterior motive that might actually relate to chronology. There have been proposals put forward that there was chronological reasons why these things were changed. So yeah, which one is right? Why do they change them? It's a good question. So after listening to all these challenges, you might be thinking, we can't trust the Genesis genealogies. When there are questions about passages of Scripture, I think it's important for us to sort of step back and think more about what we can know. So things to consider about the things that are much more clear in Scripture. So one of the things that we can notice is that there is a mature creation and a global flood. At the end of creation week, once God is done with his creative activities, there are human beings, there are animals, there are plants, flowering plants. The animals are described fish and birds and mammals and reptiles. They're all there all at once with human beings in the Garden of Eden. That's not an evolved world, I don't think. That doesn't happen in a week in evolution. So I think that sort of necessitates us taking a sort of a different perspective. We see a similar thing in the New Testament when Jesus' response to divorce in Matthew. He says, "Don't you know, from the beginning, God made them male and female." Again, implying that this is the way it was in the beginning of creation. So if human beings were there at the beginning of creation, that is not an evolutionary history. It's something else. It may not tell us exactly when it was, but it wasn't 4.5 billion years. And then the global flood, same deal. There's no evidence for a global flood if you accept that the world is 4.5 billion years old. And the geologic column records, hundreds of millions of years of history. But if you do accept that the global flood was a historical reality, as the text of Genesis seems to imply, then you end up thinking, okay, well, it's got to be somewhere, and so this geological record must be reinterpreted. So I think those are clear. Genesis 5 and 11, I think, are unique in the fact that they give you these detailed ages. Green sort of writes this off back in his 1890 paper. He sort of writes this off as saying, well, we can't put too much stock in this because we don't know what the original author meant for these ages. Yeah, but you know what? This is the only place in Scripture where we have that particular formula spelled out. Once you get beyond Genesis, it becomes really, really difficult to figure out how old things, people are and when things are happening and so forth. It's not a straightforward thing. I tried to do this once, a long time ago. Tried to do my own little chronology from the genealogies of Scripture. And yeah, once you get past Genesis, it gets really hard. So I think we have to really put some sort of stock into that. God recorded those genealogies with those ages for a reason. It's not just that they're uninterpretable and who knows what they mean. They mean something really important. And I think it's really interesting that they are unique in that they depart most from secular chronologies. When you look at the archaeological record in Israel, you can match things up reasonably well, back at least to the establishment of the kingdom and the conquest. And then things start getting a little fuzzy. And then, of course, when you get evolutionary dating in there, you get hundreds of thousands of years of human history, billions of years of Earth history. And so, yeah, those genealogies are positioned not just to give us this what appears to be chronological information, but also to give it to us at the place where we, on our own, would get it quite wrong. And I think we ought to pay attention to that. And I would also say that Green's argument is only probabilistic, obviously. It's one thing to say that there are gaps in the genealogies, and so you cannot trust the genealogies of Genesis. It's quite a different thing to say, this is what the ages actually mean. This is the actual accounting of the original whatever generations, or, to produce a manuscript that tells you various, different proto-scripture versions of this thing so that you can see that it has been modified to fit into the scriptures. None of those things are the case. All we have is this idea that, okay, well, you can't really trust genealogies. Well, maybe we can trust these. Maybe you generally can't trust genealogies, but maybe these aren't quite so bad. And I would also mention, I've already sort of touched on this, explanations exist for many of these questions. So yeah, I talked about that all through the little video here. Go back, listen to every one of them. I gave or at least I tried to give two perspectives. The sort of skeptical perspective that says, well, we really don't know. And the other perspective that says, well, it might be this. And when you look into this chronological question, you find many of those things. There are many pretty straightforward answers to a lot of these so-called discrepancies, like the extra Canaan or the age of, Terah and Abram and so forth. Those are resolvable, and they're reasonably resolvable. So, can we trust the Genesis genealogies or not? Well, I would say, number one, we can trust the Bible. And other than that, on the details, I think we can keep an open mind. I think there's good reason to think that the genealogies are there to give us chronological information that we would otherwise get very, very wrong. And I think that chronological information indicates that the Earth had thousands of years of history. I don't know that I would, stand up and take a bullet for the idea that the Earth must have been created in 4004 BC. I do not know. Maybe, maybe not. Could be longer, but it's not much longer. I don't think it's much more than, say, 10,000. And I don't know why I say that. It just seems like Scripture does not really encompass that much history. All right, well, thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this video, check us out at coresci.org/connect to learn more about Core Academy of Science. You'll find links there to important articles about what we do, as well as ways to connect with us on social media and by email. You will also find there ways to support us financially. We are dependent on your support to produce videos like this. I also invite you to check out patreon.com/research reports if you're really interested in what goes on day to day in our student mentoring ministry. There I'm putting up regular reports on many different student projects that Core Academy is involved with, not just at one school, but at many different universities and colleges around the country. I would also invite you to leave a like, subscribe to this channel, click that bell to get notifications when we put up new content. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.